Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security, hosted by the Nixon Foundation. Thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. I'm Mary Kissel with Stevens Inc., formerly of the U.S. State Department. And as always, we're very honored to have Ambassador Robert O'Brien, the former National Security Advisor, and Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, co-chairing tonight's event. And of course, we're thrilled to bring back our seminar members who have served the United States across several administrations with great distinction. Tonight, we are thinking about the unthinkable, nuclear weapons and nuclear brinksmanship, as the Biden administration readies its release of its nuclear posture review, and the United States faces threats from nuclear powers ranging from communist China to the Islamic Republic of Iran to Putin's Russia. So with that, let's start with President Nixon himself, interviewed by Frank Gannon. Cue the clip.
That the greatest danger perhaps in the future of nuclear war is not going to come from the United States or the Soviet Union, both of whom, because of the great amount of nuclear power they have, fear its use and would be deterred to use it. The greatest danger is going to come from a nation that is smaller, that is desperate, and that just wouldn't care. And this lets the genie out of the bottle. It's proliferation of nuclear weapons that concerns me at the present time and should concern the Russians, should concern the Americans. And so as I look at it, looking at the Israelis, certainly I would think they would be more responsible than many others, but let us suppose the Libyans get it. Now they are a little crazy, I think. Certainly their leadership is. And that is why we've got to get this thing under control before it's proliferated out there, because the danger of a nuclear explosion then, and which would spread worldwide, is simply unacceptable.
Is simply unacceptable. Ambassador O'Brien, I'm going to start with you. You have several generations of Americans that didn't grow up with the Soviet Union, may not appreciate what it felt like to face total annihilation. Maybe you could just kick us off and remind everyone why we're talking about this subject, because it actually isn't something that hits the news very often. Over to you, Ambassador O'Brien.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for hosting again. Look, I grew up and I was a child of the Cold War, as was Mike Pompeo. Mike was a couple of years ahead of me, so he actually patrolled the borders as a cavalry officer in Eastern Europe. So that's what we grew up with. And I'd say, Mary, that the biggest change in my lifetime on the left has been the lack of concern that you see now from the 80s over nuclear weapons. When I grew up in the 80s, the nuclear freeze movement was big. The left was concerned about arms control with the Soviet Union at the time, less concerned about China then, but it's a factor now. But they were also very concerned about nuclear proliferation. And now that concern seems to have gone away. And let me give you 4 quick examples. Number one, China. China is involved in a massive nuclear buildup. China, by their own admission, will have over 1,000 nuclear weapons in just a couple of years. And there's no interest in arms control by the Chinese. They've told us they're not going to engage in arms control negotiations. They're going to build a nuclear capability that they think puts them in the premier position in the world. And there's no complaining here, from the liberals and from the left that would at least complain about the Soviet Union arms stockpile, back in the Cold War. You take Russia. Russia has a massive advantage in nuclear weapons that are non-START compliant. So these are what are called tactical nukes. The Russians have thousands of these. They're not covered by the New START agreement. And they continue to build them. Every year they build 10s and 20s of numbers of nuclear weapons. And again, we no longer build tactical nukes. I also think that distinction is a distinction without a difference, because if you're in Warsaw, I don't think people are going to say we're glad our city was destroyed by a tactical nuke and not by a strategic nuke. That's what the Russians are doing. Again, no complaints. In the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo's team and I negotiated with the Russians a freeze of their non-New START compliant nuclear weapons in exchange for an extension of the New START treaty. And when the Biden administration came into power, for whatever reason, it's unclear why, they did a clean extension of New START with no controls on Russian buildup of strategic weapons. in Iran, the left might claim the JCPOA was some sort of arms control agreement. Really, what it was a flight path, a glide path for Iran to become a recognized nuclear power over 10 years. And as the Israelis showed when they came up with that massive cache of Iranian nuclear documents and quite a daring and bold intelligence operation, the JCPOA is premised on a lie. The Iranians had not disclosed their massive clandestine nuclear program. And so Iran is on the path to a nuclear weapon. And what's interesting there is in this volatile region, don't think that when Shia Iran obtains a nuclear weapon, which they will, even if we re-enter into the JCPOA in the next couple of weeks, as it looks like we will do, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey will all obtain nuclear weapons. None of them will be left behind the Iranians, their main rival in the region on the nuclear front. So we're going to have massive nuclear proliferation in the most volatile region in the world. And then we get to the DPRK, to North Korea. North Korea already has a nuclear stockpile. During the Trump administration, there were no tests of nuclear weapons once we engaged in some very tough diplomacy, hard-headed diplomacy. Some of it, the rhetoric was heated with references to Little Rocket Man and the president saying that his button was bigger than Kim Jong-un's button. But once those negotiations started and they were led, I give a lot of credit to Mike Pompeo, who first is CIA director and then as Secretary of State made several visits to Pyongyang. We had stopped it. Now the North Koreans are testing ballistic missiles. Granted, they're intermediate range ballistic missiles, not intercontinental, but they've started the testing, and I expect nuclear testing to start. And there doesn't seem to be any policy on behalf of the United States, diplomatic or otherwise, to stop North Korea. There's no plan for North Korea. So we have nuclear proliferation taking place in North Korea and Iran, likely in the region in the Middle East if Iran gets the nuke that they're headed to. We've got massive arms control, if not violations, but massive buildups and modernizations. And what do we have from the left? There are two things the left hasn't forgotten from the.
Before you continue, Robert, I want to put up a chart so that our viewers can see the number of nuclear weapons that are out there and where exactly they are. I believe this is from the Arms Control Association. It's a map of the world. Might be a little small on your screen there, but you'll see just the massive number, thousands of nuclear weapons in Russia, of course, the United States. The China number, probably not accurate given the opacity of the program. Back to you, Ambassador, to finish your thought.
No, I'll just conclude. Look, the left, their response to all this is to the progressives in Congress just sent a letter to the new administration, to the Biden administration, asking them not to modernize our nuclear weapons, to let our nuclear triad deteriorate its readiness and its effectiveness, leave America either defenseless or to invite some sort of nuclear blackmail or first strike against us. And it's almost a unilateral disarmament approach that they're taking. There used to be folks back in the 80s who said, well, it was better to be red than dead. And they wanted to surrender to the Russians preemptively to avoid a Russian nuclear attack on the United States. That's really what the new left is telling us and the Chinese. Now, they're not going to like it because China's not very woke, and they're not going to be treated very well. The same people that want us to unilaterally disarm would be the people who are treated worse under a Chinese or a Russian regime, which is not into their woke politics. And then the last thing I'll mention is this effort by some on the left to encourage us to renounce a no first strike policy on nuclear weapons.
I want to get to that in a little bit. Don't jump too far ahead.
I'll leave that to someone else to give but again, bad idea, and I'll let the secretary or others expound on that. But that's my 2 cents worth. We're in a proliferation, arms buildup nightmare right now, and the U.S. is really struggling without much of a plan. We need to get back in the game, Mary. Peace for strength works.
That was a tour de force of the level of threat. So if you listen to that and you're not alarmed, you should be alarmed. Secretary Pompeo, we always look at history. We learn from history. We try not to make the same mistakes as we've made in the past. What role did MAD play, mutually assured destruction, in keeping us safe? How important was that nuclear arms buildup and the accumulation of the weapons that we have today? in our national security.
Mary, it was interesting, the clip that we saw from Richard Nixon. I must say, at a slightly different time and in a slightly different way, I heard the same thing from President Trump. When you're the commander in chief, this is serious stuff. You have confrontations with Al Qaeda. There are there's problems all across the world. President Trump would remind all of us that a bad day with a nuclear weapon wasn't just a bad day. This was something that was different, and that's what I think you heard President Nixon speaking to. He would remind me that proliferation was a real problem. We need to go tackle it. So if you look at the files that he gave Ambassador Bryan and I to work on, nearly every one of them had a nuclear component. That includes the work we did in the Middle East, right? With Iran, we were very worried that if the Iranians continued down their path, that the Saudis, the Emiratis, goodness knows who else, the Egyptians might say, well, I want one too. So the follow-on corollary, right? We demand from the Emiratis that they sign a gold standard agreement that limited what they could do in terms of their enrichment capability. And they would look us in the face and saying, just make the Iranians sign that same deal, or we want the one they have. Now, other countries observe this risk. To your point about deterrence, it's a relative measurement. It's why when we went to talk with Chairman Kim, or when we withdrew from the INF, right? These were fundamentally imbalanced agreements, missile program agreements or weapons agreements. And we wanted to make sure that we had a reciprocity that would deliver the deterrence model. You call it mutually assured destruction. It's something that every fifth grader understands, right? Every fifth grader gets it. I want to make sure that if they throw the dodgeball at me, can we even do that anymore, dodgeball? If they throw the dodgeball at me, I got a dodgeball to throw back at them, right? This is pretty straightforward. And we have, for an awfully long time, allowed our systems to deteriorate. We have programs, Minuteman III, we have programs that are as old as me. And frankly, they have outused the B-52 still flying, right? Pilots half the age of the aircraft. And we have not modernized these systems in the way that China has, because they are greenfielding, right? Their systems are all new. The reason we worked so hard to bring the Chinese inside of the arms control structure was because we knew that in the end, any deal we cut with the Russians was immaterial to American national security. It wasn't going to create the confidence that we could deliver good outcomes for the American people in the event of a really bad day if the Chinese weren't part of that structure and that system. They steadfastly refused. I'm convinced that with time, we could have convinced them it was in their best interest to be part of that as well. But when I watch the Biden team begin to do their nuclear posture review, and I hear them talking about getting rid of these programs, the new bomber program, talking about not modernizing the actual weapons themselves. Robert hinted at no first use, walking away from that, right? President Biden has said, he used the language that says, well, we can only use nuclear weapons to respond to a nuclear threat. That's essentially no first use, right? What about a bioweapons threat? What about a virus that's sprung on the world? One can imagine that intentionally through military means, right? One can imagine your nuclear arsenal being important in other deterrence models that cross to the non-nuclear world as well. And I'm afraid this administration is going to take away that capacity for America to be the guarantor that we don't have that really bad day.
So I see that Congressman Waltz has just joined us. Welcome, sir. So Secretary Pompeo has just made an argument. We have to keep our nuclear deterrent up, and that means more weapons. And that means not promising to hold back, that we don't like no first use. What say you, sir?
Well, I think, a few things. Ambassador O'Brien and Secretary Pompeo covered a lot of ground, and I think they're absolutely right. I think the biggest threat to modernization right now is actually Congress's dysfunction and the continuing resolution. I think with Build Back Better now, chunky plan or breakup plan. We've just literally watched an entire year and now this year of legislative time move away from us, and we still don't have a budget. We still don't have appropriations. And what does that mean to our viewers and Americans? Well, that means no new ships, planes. No new hypersonic programs to counter the Chinese. No new satellites to be able to detect theirs. And importantly, as both the ambassador and the secretary were just talking about, we finally got agreement after years and years of delay, to update our Minimum 3 program with the ground-based strategic deterrent, which is absolutely critical. There was a move from the left to move to a BIAD, so only bomber and submarine, and an argument that we didn't even really need ICBMs as a deterrent. And we can delve into why that was fallacy, but we got beyond that, and we got bipartisan agreement to finally begin updating our ICBM fleet. And now, everybody sees the defense bill passed, but unless you have a budget deal and appropriations, put money towards it, you're not going to get any of that. So that has me incredibly concerned. And just one more piece on the proliferation that I don't think we can take our eye off, and that's Pakistan and their nuclear arsenal. The various terrorist organizations still absolutely have their designs on getting their hands on a nuke. We now have a terrorist superstate right next door in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda and ISIS still have designs on getting their hands. And the bottom line is, as I tell people all the time, you had a population in Iraq of 25 million, population in Afghanistan 30 million, population in Pakistan of 200 million plus with a nuclear arsenal. If that state devolves into chaos, or even worse, is taken over by a fundamentalist regime, we have a huge problem on our hands. And I think with all of that, I think everybody's going to want to drink after talking to us. But I'll just end with the point of Congress's dysfunction right now. I think is the biggest.
So Congress is dysfunctional. Man bites dog. Is that what you're saying, Congressman?
Got it. Sorry.
It's actually, you've made such an important point, which is that not all nuclear powers are created equal. A United States and a France and a Britain are not going to behave in the same way as potentially a Pakistan. And there's another fantastic President Nixon clip on this, on proliferation. Let's cue that up with Frank Gannon again.
Isn't it too late, though, to stop proliferation? There's so much material out there. Is it really practical? It's like the argument about calling in handguns, that there's just so many out there.
Very difficult. But unless the two major countries find some way to control themselves, then there will be no inhibiting effect on other countries. No, I don't think you can say that because these weapons are so terrible, they're not going to be had by others. But on the other hand, if the United States and the Soviet Union can find some agreement between themselves, it will have some restraining effect.
Some restraining effect. I don't know if that was exactly the clip I was thinking of, but Alex Gray, I'm going to go over to you just to explicate this point a little bit, that not all nuclear powers are equal, and that's another problem of proliferation. Over to you, Alex.
Well, thanks, Mary. And it's an important point, particularly as we think about China and we think about the opacity of their buildup, the lack of understanding of what exactly China's sought to do with its nuclear arsenal over the last 20 years. And part of the concern I think a lot of us had in the Trump administration, and Secretary Pompeo was obviously a huge leader on this and led the way, was in terms of thinking about some of the antiquated structures that we had in place that weren't keeping up with the challenge posed by China. And the INF Treaty is the obvious example. And I think when we look back at the Trump administration, getting out of the INF Treaty is going to be one of its really pivotal successes. And probably, I think, partially not for the reason people fully appreciate. When you look at the Pacific and you look at the challenge that we have with anti-access and area denial, Chinese weapons in the region, and you think about how can the United States counter that, one of the ways in which we're going to be doing that over the next 10, 20 years is by having our own capabilities, our own mid-range missile capabilities in the Pacific to protect our interests as you look at the approaches from Hawaii and the West Coast into East Asia. And that's really an area where having the ability, you look at what the Marine Corps is now experimenting experimenting with. You look at some of the ideas that are coming out of the Pentagon to take the Army into the next generation of land-based anti-ship missiles, all things that we would have been restricted in doing if you had followed the INF treaty to its letter. And so I think that's an area where we're going to look back and be very grateful for the leadership of folks like the President Trump and Secretary Pompeo as we think about China and its modernization in the years ahead.
Monica Crowley, you had a comment. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary. It's so nice to see everybody tonight. I've got a 2 or 3-pronged question that I'd like for Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador O'Brien, and the rest of the group to address. So you just played that great clip of President Nixon. Nixon used to say that the Soviet regime was evil, but they weren't stupid, and its leaders were rational actors, which is why in the 20th century, the mutually assured destruction doctrine really worked. It was a constraining doctrine because you were dealing with rational actors. So I'm just curious, now that we're in the 21st century, what the view is on the MAD doctrine, and does it still apply if now we're dealing with non-state actors that may not be entirely rational? And also, I think Ambassador O'Brien brought up the issue of tactical nuclear weapons. I've noticed over the last year, and I'm curious if you all have noticed this as well, that there is somewhat looser public talk about the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons, which is horrifying on its face. And then how do we deal with that? Does that public discussion in the discourse of tactical nukes mean that the usage of them is more likely? And then the final point on this multi-pronged question is about modernization of the nuclear arsenal. So we often talk about the state of our nuclear weapon arsenal, but if so much of it is moldering away in silos and other locations, is it really still an effective deterrent? So I open it up to Secretary Pompeo. Brian,
that's a lot. Secretary Pompeo, you just came out with a massive document that covers a lot of what Monica just put forward. Why don't you take the first bite of that?
Let me take the piece on mutual assured destruction. It is the case that rogue actors will behave differently. Remember, that doctrine depends on the ability to strike after you've been struck, right? To be able to respond. It's why the triad is so important. If you're one of those rogue actors, you're not thinking about striking after you've been struck. You have almost nothing to lose by the time you've made that decision. So that model doesn't apply to what, it's hard, these terms are loose, but to non-strategic actors. Their calculus is different. They see it as just another weapon system, another tool, like they might talk about cyber or something else that they had the ability to do. They also, these actors aren't going to have thousands of weapons, right? They're not going to have an entire program. They'll be lucky to have a capability, but they could certainly use that in a way that could create coercive effect. And it causes a very different set, but the doctrine of mutual assured destruction doesn't slow them down a heck of a lot. One of the things that I talked about in the paper that I wrote was not only these programs that relate to weapons, but the capacity to do what Reagan had tried to do with the Strategic Defense Initiative. Because space was short, I called it SDI-2. But this notion that we can create space through defensive weapon systems. I don't mean outer space. I mean distance and time, to give us the reaction capacity that we need to nation states using missile systems to project their nuclear capability, is still really, really important to insert that uncertainty into their knowledge about whether they can actually inflict harm on the United States with a strike. Makes a heck of a lot of difference in our deterrence model as well. We have semiconductors are better. Lots of things are better than they were back in the 1980s. We could actually do that if we would set America's best minds to it, and we could create even more deterrence than we were able to achieve through Reagan's initial glance at what a defensive system or set of systems might look like.
Mr. Secretary, can we protect today against hypersonic missiles from places like China?
It's a very difficult problem because there's a risk that strategic warning won't be available. If it's in an orbital system that can go through a guided missile path that is more like a cruise missile, not just a kinetic or ballistic fall, it is a very difficult problem set today. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Ambassador O'Brien, do you want to add here?
Let me just jump in, and I agree with everything Mike said. It's a tough problem. We've got to invest more in defenses, but we're not without capabilities, and our adversaries should know that. And neither Mike or I can talk about those or some of the others on the line, but we're not without capabilities, and our adversaries need to be very clear on that. But listen, the reason MAD works is MAD works when both sides understand that they can't win a nuclear engagement. And even with rational actors, and I would put Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in the rational actor category. They're ambitious, they're aggressive, they have policy goals that are very different than ours, but they don't want to see their countries destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. The problem that you have is if one side's nuclear capability deteriorates and is not modern, for example, isn't based on hypersonic platforms, is based on older platforms, or no longer is considered a modern system. There's a temptation for even a rational actor to believe that they could prevail if they engaged in a first strike that was overwhelming. And the systems that Mike was talking about, the fractional orbit system, the fractional Earth orbit bombardment system that the Chinese demonstrated just recently, which was really a Sputnik moment for the West, certainly for America, that is a first strike type weapon. And we have to be very careful that one side, even with rational actors, doesn't believe that they could prevail if they launched a first strike, because that undermines the whole theoretical underpinning of a MAD situation, of a mutually assured destructive situation.
I want to also raise the role of presidential leadership, because it's not just about how many nuclear weapons you have and the kinds of systems that you have. It's also the willingness to use it. And President Nixon faced this several times in his presidency. I want to play a clip from him about how he stared down the Soviets. Cue the tape.
In October of 1973, American forces were put on worldwide nuclear alert. How close did we come to nuclear war in October of 1973?
I don't think we came very close, actually. I think what happened is that the alert was in response to the Soviet Union putting its airborne divisions on alert, putting 85 ships into the Mediterranean, ships equipped with helicopters and landing barges and the rest. And Brezhnev indicating to me through a message that unless we would join him in sending American forces in, along with Russian forces, to help keep the peace in that area, that he would move in unilaterally. We had to respond with an alert in order to keep them out.
At the time when you...
we had it, and when sometimes when people ask, well, when you call the alert, which incidentally was not just of nuclear forces, even just as important, all of our conventional forces in the Mediterranean, the fleet, which was quite powerful, they were also put on alert. And when the follow-up question there is often, well, suppose the Russians had moved in with divisions, airborne divisions and otherwise, into the Mideast. Would you have used the nuclear option? And my answer to that is that it isn't important what I might have done. The important thing is Brezhnev thought I might. And he thought I might because of the track record I'd already established. And when people say, would you have done this or that, on the other thing, in a case like that, my answer goes back to my poker playing days. When you got a hole card, you never show it unless they call you.
Oh, that's a great clip. When you've got a whole card, never show your hand unless they call you. So it's not just about the weapons. It's also about presidential determination, and just going back to that basic definition of deterrence that we talked about in the last seminar. It's not just what you have, it's the will to use it. Secretary Pompeo, I'm going to lean on you a little bit again, because we've had several examples of presidents like President Nixon, also President Reagan, President Trump, who have threatened to use force and were credible in doing so. Contrast that to what we're seeing today and some of the misbehavior that Ambassador O'Brien and others have outlined from some of the other nuclear powers in the world.
This isn't political. It's about how other leaders view American leadership. It's what President Nixon spoke to exactly, right? He said, I'm not going to tell you my answer, but I can tell you what the answer our adversaries believed might well be in the offing. Whether it's, President Biden has a lot of history with some of these leaders. How many Codels did he go on, right? These leaders know him as a person, right? President Nixon talked about his track record. I think he meant his lifelong track record, the things he'd written, the things he'd said, his demonstrated character, his service in the Navy, all of those things, right? These leaders know the profile of the human beings occupying the most important position in the world. And so I think that track record matters an awful lot. And you can't make it up. When you get on your back foot and there's 100,000 soldiers in Western Russia and a bunch of equipment in Belarus, you're behind that. You're behind the power curve, and catching up and establishing deterrence in that moment is incredibly difficult because you have already demonstrated that your credibility is at risk. So I hope this administration will figure out how to get it right, not just for the moment, not just for the ability of wheat to flow through the Black Sea, which matters an awful lot to the people who are trying to eat bread in Idaho and Texas, right? 30% of the world's red winter wheat moves through that sea. But this has ramifications for the next 3 years as well. How does not only the president, but the president's team around him demonstrate their resolve in a credible way that the world understands that they will actually deliver on the things that they have said that they would do? These are important questions, and we build up track records over years and years of our lives. And I hope that President Biden and his team's track record is sufficient.
Well, that's right. It shouldn't be partisan. U.S. national security is in everybody's interest. Republican, Democrat, Independent, it doesn't matter. We want to be safe and secure as Americans. I want to go to Morgan Ortegas, who is part of our team at the State Department, just to reflect on the current negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran, because that seems to be exactly the opposite of the approach that Secretary Pompeo just laid out, where the Iranians keep demanding things, keep breaking UN Security Council resolutions, keep enriching uranium, keep kicking the inspectors out. And yet we still keep coming back to the table. So what does that mean for U.S. nuclear deterrence? Morgan.
Thanks, Mary. So listen, I don't even think these are negotiations, right? We're not talking directly to the Iranians. What we're instead doing is begging behind closed doors to our intermediaries from other nations who go behind closed doors and talk to the Iranians. Listen, I think it's an abominable disgrace. If there's one thing that Secretary Pompeo and President Trump handed this administration, the Biden administration, it was all the leverage in the world that they can want. Listen, we all weren't fans of the JCPOA, principally because it did not actually prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It just kicked the can down the road. I often say it's only in Washington, D.C. That you think that you deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for effectively making someone coming after you deal with your problem, right? That's all they did through the JCPOA. It was, deterring a nuclear weapon potentially maybe by a few years, by 10 years, something like that. So I think, again, when this administration came in, we handed them all the leverage in the world. We had the Iranian economy on the ropes. We had the regime on the ropes. The people were protesting. And instead of using that leverage, they've squandered it and they sit behind closed doors and beg a regime. And as we've learned in Afghanistan, in my opinion, through the just utter failure, the loss of American lives, and the failure to exit in a way that is honorable. What we learned from Biden's failure in Afghanistan is that reverberates and has consequences for every theater, right? Every rogue actor, every despot knows now what they could get away with President Biden. So I think, we handed them 4 peace deals, the first in 26 years. We handed them a peaceful Middle East, and they have squandered that. But I think, Mary, and thank you for asking me that, but I also think getting back to the bigger picture of this, and I'd love for the secretary or the ambassador to also share their thoughts on this, especially Secretary Pompeo, having once been a politician. I think as much as important this conversation is, and I absolutely love it, and all of our conversations that we have at the Nixon Seminar are intellectual and fascinating, and I think make all of us challenge our own assumptions. I think the one thing that we always have to remember is how do we bring the American people along with us? And at a time when we are, what did the budget, the debt hit what, 30? Was it 30 trillion today, Mary? That it hit, former Wall Street Journal editor, or op-ed page, everything they did. You're amazing, opinion writer. So with the debt and the deficit hitting the levels that it did today, with Americans increasingly concerned about these massive entitlement programs, I think what I'm worried about as a policymaker and a communicator is how do we effectively convince the American people that it is in their best interest to spend the kind of funds and money that we're going to need to spend to keep up with the Chinese and Russians and North Koreans and other rogue actors that are quite frankly outspending us on these future weapons.
Yeah, it's a massive threat, and you're right, Morgan. It's incredible that it doesn't get more attention, but maybe that's because the kind of threats that we face are so different today than they were in Nixon's time. You didn't really have cyber threats. You didn't have ISIS. You didn't have all these many and varied predations. And you also didn't have as many powerful regimes. You had basically a bipolar world. And, we don't really have that so much anymore. Kim Reed also served in the last administration and is an experienced observer of foreign policy. Kim, you wanted to join us here. Mike is over to you.
Thank you, Mary. And I just want to say thank you to all the viewers this evening. I worked for many years on Capitol Hill, and I hope Congressman Waltz can comment on this. But we're looking at President Biden putting out a new nuclear posture review. And just a few days ago, we saw over 50 congressmen and senators, led by Senators Markey and Merkley, really put the pressure on. And so what happens if we go from our policy of strategic ambiguity to no first use or sole purpose? What will our allies think? And are they going to view this as a betrayal, weak? Appeasement, and what does this document really mean if we have North Korea do a chemical bioweapon attack? What are we able to do then? So just love to get the Congressman's thoughts and Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien.
Great. Well, I know Secretary Pompeo has to leave a bit early tonight. He's got an engagement. So, Mr. Secretary, do you have time to weigh in on that quickly? And then I'm going to throw it over to the Congressman from Florida.
I do. Two thoughts. First, I want to tackle what Morgan suggested. The American people actually care about this. When American leaders will take the time and show the respect needed to explain why these things matter, what the connectivity is, why something like this actually impacts their family, their church, their life, their community. Sometimes the argument's a little complicated, but if you lay it down for them, my observation is the American people do want to make sure that their boys and girls who are serving in the military or their friends who are studying abroad are in places that are safe and secure. I think the American people actually do get it if leaders are prepared to talk about it in a sincere, honest way. So I think that it's about good leadership. Second, this point that Kim makes is very real. Our allies are watching what we're going to do. The collective deterrence that will be needed from our friends in Europe. Someone earlier tonight, I think it was Alex, suggested we're going to need ground-based systems that are in some places that are much closer to China than we are here in the United States. Our friends and allies are going to see that if we're not prepared to do the right thing here in the United States, the chance of them taking risk, domestic risk in their own country, or risk that the bad guy will come chase them first, is something that we need to contemplate as the Biden administration thinks about how to posture America in the world.
Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's an honor as always. Now, Congressman Waltz, the nuclear posture review, it's not something that is getting an awful lot of attention in the mainstream media or even the fringe media. Not many people are talking about it. Kim raises it. It's such an important question. What does it mean? Why should we care?
Well, I think, look, on the review, we've been reassured repeatedly you're not going to see an explicit no first use, but I do think you're going to see some version of a quote sole purpose, which the ambassador I think referred to earlier, and kind of what nuclear weapons can be used for, what they can't. I'm still optimistic at the end of the day, particularly on the armed services, both in the Senate and the House committee, that we're going to keep our posture pretty much as it is. We just have to get the appropriations in place, the funding in place to modernize it. And I want to hit two additional points. One, on the tactical piece, I thought that was a very good question from Monica. We are increasingly seeing both in Russian doctrine and reporting and their acquisitions, this escalation for de-escalation notion that they could get away with using tactical nukes, whether that's on a port, carrier battle group, command and control center, and essentially on the premise that the United States would not reply or respond in kind because of mutually assured destruction. And because we've allowed our tactical nukes to atrophy in many ways, and because of lack of support in that intermediate range, I do think I have some real concerns there. This last defense bill that we just passed, I thought made some important steps to get at it. But if I beat a dead horse tonight, that if we don't get the appropriation, we don't make those steps. And I think that's a point that we do have to continue to make to the American people. That heck, we have to make it to members of my party. It's just hard, I think, for a lot of people to appreciate how devastating these continuing resolutions are for defense. And then the last piece, I just don't want to. It's a little tangential. I don't want to bypass it though, but the Arctic and what the Russians in particular and the Chinese increasingly are doing in the Arctic is very important, shouldn't be ignored. But the bottom line is, I think a lot of Americans think of nuclear weapons flying, they think of east-west, but it's actually north-south over the Arctic. And with the Russians increasingly pressing into it, it only cuts our defense and our reaction time, our decision time, into shorter and shorter and very dangerous increments. And as someone who has to stand in front of town halls and explain all of this stuff, Morgan, when the left tries to point to debt and defense is defending this country as a driver of debt, you take it where the real debt driver is, and that's our mandatory spending on entitlements. That is now 75% of our federal budget on overdrive, and they keep trying to add to it. So it's not modernizing our nuclear fleet that's going to drive us into bankruptcy. It's the entitlement programs that nobody wants to touch.
Yep. Well, it's something that deserves much more attention. We don't know when this nuclear posture review is going to be released, but we do expect it sometime soon. And our allies certainly are paying attention. Britain, Japan, and elsewhere.
I expect it to be delayed. I don't expect the administration to release it while with the potential of Russian tanks rolling through Kyiv and heading towards NATO borders. So if they do release it, it's going to be very quiet, but I expect it to be delayed.
On that, can we trust actors like Russia and China to negotiate with us in good faith? The Chinese have simply refused to come to the table. Putin has broken his promises on treaties. Ambassador O'Brien, you were in the room for a lot of these discussions on many topics with your counterparts in those capitals. What is your take on that? Is it worth the effort, the diplomatic effort, to try to get these people to the table?
Well, I think it's worth the effort, but it goes back to that famous Reagan statement of trust but verify. So, I think the Russians are a little different than the Chinese. It's Communist Party doctrine to lie to advance the party. I mean, that's classic Marxist-Leninism. The Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist party, and so you can't trust them at their word. you have to verify what they're doing. With respect to China, it will be very difficult because any type of inspection regime would be quite onerous. The Chinese have miles and miles and miles of tunnels where their artillery divisions are already burrowed in. So verifying what they did, it would be difficult, but it could be done. It's a technical feat that we could certainly overcome. One of the reasons we weren't able to come to an agreement with the Russians on their non-New START compliant weapons, in other words, are tactical nukes that aren't covered by New START, is they wanted to basically send us a letter certifying that they hadn't increased the stockpile. We wanted real verification. I mean, that's always the crux of any arms control agreement, and it has been for 75 years since we started engaging in these post-World War II, is you have to have, arms control means nothing if there's not verification. And so it's critical that any treaty that's entered into, if it makes sense for the United States, I'm not against doing it, but we do have to have really robust verification measures in place.
Well, that was, of course.
And totalitarian governments and authoritarian governments don't like those because they tend to be, the more robust they are, the more intrusive they are. And those sorts of regimes don't like intrusive inspections of their military facilities.
Yeah, well, that's an understatement if I've ever heard one. Remember the agreed framework with North Korea that the Clinton administration negotiated? And in fact, Wendy Sherman, who's now negotiating with the Iranians, negotiated the agreed framework. And by the way, the Iran nuclear deal, both of which were broken pretty much as they were being signed. So that might tell you something. I want to go back to Monica Crowley.
Maybe it's meatloaf and we'll get lucky 2 out of 3 in bed, so.
We're laughing, but we're cringing on the inside. Monica Crowley, jump in here.
Thank you, Mary. And I want to thank Congressman Waltz for talking about the Arctic region and what the Russians are doing there. It's such a critical issue. It does not get nearly enough attention, and it's a personal point of interest for me. So thank you, Congressman Waltz. I want to ask the Congressman and Ambassador O'Brien if they both wouldn't mind weighing in on this question. So we've talked about ICBMs and intermediate range and also tactical nuclear weapons, but one area that we haven't discussed yet tonight is the briefcase bomb, dirty nuclear weapons. And that conversation and that concern was really very paramount after 9/11. A lot of people were very concerned about somebody smuggling in some sort of nuclear device into New York City and detonating one, and you'd get all kinds of radioactive pollution and cascading death and destruction. So that has really receded since 9/11. But I think with the collapse of Afghanistan and that now being a new base of operations for terrorist activity, coupled with the wide open border where anybody is walking across with God knows what, could you speak to where we are on that threat and why we haven't seen it more publicly discussed? Because it seems to me that it should be right at the top of what we're very concerned about. Congressman Waltz.
Yeah, just a couple of points there. You're right; it has receded, and I think counterterrorism writ large is now kind of viewed as passé, right? The pendulum swinging, and I think rightly. I mean, it certainly is not the existential threat that China is, and that Russia could be with its nuclear arsenal. However, I think the likelihood has just increased dramatically, as you just mentioned, with the Taliban caliphate, with the destabilizing effect I believe that will have on Pakistan, with Pakistan's move to create more tactical nukes than strategic, and then also with their concern tends to be India, and so therefore they're looking to disperse their systems, which makes them more vulnerable to proliferation from terrorism. Without going too deeply into it, I could tell you that it's still absolutely Al-Qaeda and ISIS's aim to get their hands on a weapon of mass destruction. It doesn't necessarily have to be a nuke or a dirty bomb. They still aim to develop biological capabilities as well, and we've seen how relatively easy those are in the wake of this pandemic and how devastating they can be. Interestingly within, and I think importantly within the U.S. government, the proponency within the Defense Department has shifted for that type of proliferation to the Special Operations Command and away from the Strategic Forces Command that was worried about all kinds of other things. And I think that was a good and important move. And within that, the Joint Special Operations Command, our most elite special operators, are absolutely training against that problem set and very focused on it. So that should give everybody some comfort that we truly have the best of our best taking a look at it. And just the final piece, back to the Iran deal and the chain of events that will, I think that will spark if Iran does indeed go nuclear. I completely agree with the ambassador. That means the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, the Saudis, I think, could immediately get theirs from Pakistan, who the Saudis funded the Pakistani program, and I think our risk then of some type of loose nuke just will increase exponentially. On that happy note.
Yeah, this is one of the more depressing seminars we've ever conducted.
Yeah, I know.
Ambassador O'Brien, just to that point, with the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban, thanks to the Biden administration's withdrawal, layered on top of the Islamic Republic of Iran sheltering the Al-Qaeda leadership, layer on top of that, China cooperating with Iran, buying Iranian oil. You've got this network, like a new axis of evil, except it seems to be bigger than an axis of evil. You seem to have many axes here, all spinning together at the same time. When you think about this problem, what's your advice to your counterpart who's sitting in the White House right now? I mean, these aren't easy jobs. Not all of us know that. But what would you say to a Jake Sullivan today?
Well, listen, it's the most sobering issue that we face is nuclear or some sort of nuclear chem bio combination of attack or individual attack by a weapon of mass destruction. I'll tell you that the most probably burdensome briefing that you receive as a national security advisor, it happens the first day or two, is you're briefed on the nuclear football that the military aid carries around with the president, and which contains the plans for a nuclear counterstrike and the president's options in the event of a nuclear war. And it's extraordinarily sobering. Monica brought up a very good point, I thought, with the and it's what we think of with the proliferation, especially when it comes to non-state actors. She talked about the briefcase bomb. That's usually associated with a great power. It's pretty difficult to miniaturize a nuclear weapon to get it small enough to fit into even a large briefcase. But there were always rumors that the Russians had them and could deploy them to American cities if necessary. Also concerning, probably more concerning than a great power trying to smuggle in a briefcase bomb, because they have such great capability with their missiles that it's probably not necessary. If one of those got loose, though, and Mike addressed that, Congressman Waltz addressed that, if one of those got loose and got in the hands of a terrorist, that would be extraordinarily devastating. So I hope the Russians and the Chinese, to the extent that they've experimented with those weapons platforms, are keeping them under tight lock and key or dismantling them. But the other issue is more of a dirty bomb, a radiological device that would probably come in a container on a merchant ship into one of our ports. And I can tell you the U.S. Coast Guard is the most underrated of our branches of our military service. They are terrific. They do a great job. They've got detection capability. And working with our JSOC operators, if they detect that sort of a device coming in, working with our special forces who are trained, that's one of their primary missions in addition to hostage rescue and intelligence collection, addressing a nuclear event or a chem bio event in the U.S. is one of their key priorities now. I think we could probably handle it, but again, there are so many containers. Anyone who's seen a container ship and seen how many containers are on each ship, and then seen how many ships are backed up out into Los Angeles Harbor or outside of Charleston or New York or Oakland, California, these major ports, it's a needle in a haystack situation. So we've got to be incredibly vigilant. And that's something I think the American people will understand, that part of the defense budget goes to, and our Homeland Security budget goes to making sure that our ports and airports and borders are safe. So real serious issues. Al-Qaeda would love nothing more. ISIS would love nothing more than to bring one of these devices or a chemical or biological weapon into this country and kill as many Americans as they could. And so we have to remain vigilant, and we have to invest the resources to protect the country, because everything else, I mean, this goes to the broader question on the continuing resolution and the one that Morgan raised, the Secretary addressed, how do we explain this to the American people? But the foundation upon which our prosperity is built, and we're the most prosperous country in the history of the world, is on having a safe America. And we've traditionally benefited from two great oceans, keep giving us distance and keeping us safe. But with modern, with cyber attacks, with nuclear attacks, with chemical biological agents, the world has gotten smaller. And so we're going to have to work harder than we ever had in the past to keep America safe. And that investment, that 20-some% of the budget that we spend on our defense is the most important investment we can make. Everything else hinges, whether it's climate or conservation or justice or whatever your issue is, right or left in this country. The foundation is making sure that we have a country in which all those experiments can take place.
Yeah, I'm just reminded too that it's not necessarily an even playing field. You go back to Albert Wohlstetter and the delicate balance of terror. I'm going to put that quote just really quickly up on the screen. I know we're running out of time here, but he said, "A totalitarian country can preserve secrecy about the capabilities and disposition of his forces very much better than a Western democracy." That was back in 1959. And it just makes you think of communist China today. Congressman Waltz, I just want to get you in here very briefly, because Ambassador O'Brien just talked about all the problems we have on the ground, but we have problems in the skies too, don't we?
Yeah, I think we should also just take a second to mention the space component to all of this. And I sit on both the Space Committee that is oversight of our civilian aspects, but then also on strategic forces with oversight of the national security space. The Chinese are launching more than the United States and the rest of the world combined. They are on track to have their own separate space station. They're on track to have a manned station on the moon. But importantly, in the nuclear context, much like on conventional arms control, they really won't engage on rules of the road in space at all. The Russians, we have a longstanding dialogue and longstanding understandings. And as they develop offensive capabilities, both terrestrial and in space itself, there's really some dangerous gray areas that we're stepping into. You can imagine if, as they develop those offensive capabilities, they whether deliberately or inadvertently interfere with the capabilities of one of our command and control or early warnings that we could take or misconstrue as a preemptive attack. So really getting them to the table and understanding that you don't fly this close to certain satellites, or you don't do this or you don't do that, I think is really important. And I don't mean to scare everyone, but it's they won't even talk to us at this point, and that's just something that we also can't lose sight of.
Yeah, and we did get into several situations with the Soviets where we did come close to nuclear conflict. I'd remind everybody of that. We are unfortunately out of time, and while we always enjoy these seminar discussions, we'd like to keep the conversation going in between our monthly sessions. So our seminar members are all very active participants on social media. So please do follow them and follow the Nixon Foundation. If we can, let's get those Twitter handles on the screen if we have them. But for now, we would love to hear from you. And we appreciate your time. We know you're busy people and you could spend it in many, many ways. So I want to thank again our co-chairs, Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien. It's fabulous to have you here, as well as our distinguished seminar members. Fascinating people with fascinating ideas, tackling some of the world's toughest problems. That's it for tonight's Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm Mary Kissel. Thanks for listening.